This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. I'm happy to welcome back with me today Caroline Rose. She is a senior analyst and program head at the Power Vacuums program at the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C. Caroline, thanks for taking the time to join me again today.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
The question I want to start asking you is about what we're seeing as interactions restarting between Turkey and the United Emirates, but also Turkey's relationship with Qatar. But before we go into the two of those, I'd like to ask you about what might be the elephant in the room, and that's namely what impact the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan might be having on the relationship Turkey has with these Gulf monarchies, like whether it's influencing any convergence with Qatar or any de-escalation with the UAE. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know that's such an important question. And I think when we talk about the withdrawal in Afghanistan, we don't really think about the, outside and other regional ramifications and implications that it's going to have specifically in the Middle East. We talk about Asia, we talk about Central Asia, South Asia, but we don't necessarily talk about the Middle East, the Gulf specifically, and particularly Turkey's foreign policy. And I think that, like Afghanistan, I think we'll have the same discussion with Iraq and Syria, where inevitable US drawdowns, they are changing the calculation within Ankara. They're also changing the calculations within, the UAE, within Saudi Arabia, other Gulf powers. And they're also bringing together a lot of these former rivals and competitors, realigning themselves to create new alliance structures in the region in the wake of US withdrawal and in that absence to fill this void. And the reason because of this is because I think that they're looking at the withdrawal in Afghanistan as a signal that this is where US policy is headed. We're going to see similar policies implemented, in Iraq and Syria within the next few years, likely with this administration. And I think that, with Turkey, both Turkey and the UAE and its GCC allies, they're recognizing that while the United States will support them financially, militarily, to an extent, they're going to have a lessened role, and they're intending on having a more distanced role in the Middle East. And on security matters, on economic matters, the United States, you cannot necessarily count on it as it pivots towards great power competition. And so for Erdogan, for MBZ, for a number of other leaders, they are scrambling to realign their foreign policies in the wake of this, because the one power, the one competitor that they are worried about above all else is going to be Iran. Essentially, they are feeling, empathetic, if we apply empathetic analysis to this, they feel like the United States is leaving them alone in a room with Tehran and Tehran's proxy networks that are trying to create this regional strategy and this access in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so Turkey, with knowing this and that this is going to be a reality, Turkey and many of its former rivals are starting to feel out how cooperation could take place, how financial relationships could be resumed, what spaces for political cooperation and even security cooperation are there, knowing that the United States is going to continue to reduce its presence in the Middle East.
Between the Gulf countries that we're going to be talking about today, I want to ask more about the UAE, of course, because of the developments we saw in that direction. But just before we go into that, I want to ask you something about Qatar, because like many other countries around the world, Turkey appears to be relying very heavily on Qatar to facilitate some access to Afghanistan, especially when it comes to Kabul's international airport. As you know, Turkey was looking for a security role that would outlast the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and it has been up in the air since that happened. and it's unclear what form that mission will take, despite some fragmentary reports we're getting that hint in some policy still existing, some policy ambition still existing there. But they seem to be working almost hand in glove with the Qataris right now. And what I want to ask you is, do you think that Turkey and Qatar, in the case of Afghanistan, actually share the same goals with their engagement, or do they have separate ones that just happen to be complementary in this case?
I think that they have very similar goals. And on top of that, I think it's in some cases, it's a bit too early to tell, just because right now, with now a Talibanized Kabul, Talibanized government in Afghanistan, we're trying to see where the chips are going to fall, certainly with how governments are going to approach recognition, credibility, legitimacy of the government there. But in terms of the evacuation itself, I think that the Qatar has, and both Turkey and Qatar, they've tried to essentially position themselves and pose themselves as diplomatic intermediaries in this arena. Also try and increase support, increase humanitarian assistance, and try and position themselves as leaders in this arena that can not only, of course, gain the respect and recognition from the United States, but also other NATO allies as well. So, and I think a lot of other countries, I don't think it's just Qatar and Turkey that are trying to do this. A number of other countries, whether it be evacuation, plans and sending over commercial airlines and planes, or using non-governmental organizations and some of their own governmental tools to essentially help with the evacuations, help with humanitarian assistance and whatnot. And so really Afghanistan is posing, it's becoming somewhat of an arena for this kind of diplomatic competition to try and determine what countries are going to be the regional powers that are going to compete in Central Asia. Whose backyard is it? What kind of influence are they going to be able to leverage against or along with the Taliban? And so, yeah, I think that their strategies are certainly complementary. Also, of course, with the very historic alliance that they've made since the 2010s, and I think that this is certainly building on this, and it's complementary to that.
And this is coming almost at something of a zenith in the relationship between the two of them, after all, because I know that you and I have spoken about Turkey's relationship with Qatar in the past, and Qatar, of course, was very reliant on Turkey during the 4-year blockade that began in 2017 and ended at the beginning of this year. But of course, Turkey relies on Qatar too, whether it was for financial support for its own economy or even interventions in Libya.
Absolutely. No, and that really defined especially in 2019 and 2020. Goodness, have things changed, because exactly, they were incredibly close on diplomatic, economic, and political levels. And on top of that, they collaborated in redefining the political and diplomatic landscape of the Middle East. They essentially, this partnership reconfigured a lot of alliance systems. It strengthened the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum in the Mediterranean. It defined a lot of the leverage and political processes in Libya and Syria, even in Somalia. And so, yes, I mean, this is absolutely building upon that pre-existing relationship. But now, of course, and I'm sure you're going to ask a few questions about this, and we'll touch upon this, but now other and former rivals and potential partners are coming into the fold. And, it's going to be really interesting to see how Ankara and Qatar, how they essentially balance this relationship in the context of now opening up a bit more to these other countries.
And that leads to our segue into the second elephant in the room, which is the UAE in that case, because we saw some really surprising moves in the last month or so, where President Erdogan received the national security advisor of the UAE earlier in August, and they spoke about what the Turkish media said was investment opportunities and a very vague description of regional issues of concern between the two of them. And that ended up appearing to facilitate a call between Erdogan and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, not long afterwards. And I think that in the last decade or so you've had very few relationships as frosty and competitive as Turkey's and the United Arab Emirates is. So what I want to ask you is, what do you think changed? How has everything that's been happening in the last year or even decade altered this, led us to this point where the threat perceptions that the two seem to have of each other appear to be lessening?
Great question. And I think for a lot of folks that have been following the region, in 2020 and 2019, it was, if you were looking at the region every day, you would wake up expecting there to be some sort of, incident between the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Qatar, Greece. Turkish behavior was a lot different then. You were very used to news stories about, Turkish maritime vessels getting into some sort of clash, with rivals in the Eastern Mediterranean, or something going down in Libya, or a spat over Somalia or Syria. And now it's become a lot quiet. You've seen a lot more moderated behavior among Erdogan's government and its officials. Same with media outlets, and the same, of course, with the UAE and Egypt as well. While parallel to all of this, of course, while Turkey is, of course, opening up ties with the UAE, it's also opening up ties with Egypt. They just had a delegation visit Ankara, and they had this very important first track direct dialogue, which hasn't happened since, I believe, 2013. So, it's very much opening up between Turkey, the UAE, and some of its former rivals in the Middle East. What I think incentivized Turkey to do this, and same goes for the UAE. I think that certainly there is an economic imperative. I think that the behavior of trying to push the limit with a lot of its rivals in the Mediterranean and its competitors in the region. I think that it really economically isolated them. Of course, you had the Saudi Arabian boycott on Turkish goods. It's still ongoing, and a lot of GCC countries followed in raising tensions and hostilities with Turkey. And I think that of course, at the time where the lira is at such a low and weak point, and on top of that, inflation is up as 19% in the country, Turkey is looking for some economic ways out, financial lifelines, other than, of course, having Qatar bail it out consecutively, particularly with foreign reserves. So I think that economics certainly factors in as one of the first reasons. I think secondly, too, Turkey recognized that its previous strategy of trying to push the limit was not working, and it was also intensifying and in some cases converging other regional alliance systems to rally against it, when it recognized that there's actually some shared space and some shared interests that it can collaborate on, especially in the wake of US withdrawal. So, in 2020 especially, you started to see not only the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which included a lot of Southern European countries, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, and a number of other Mediterranean countries that were essentially trying to build a consensus and build up and position itself against Turkish moves there. You also started to see collaboration both in the defense sphere and in the political and economic sphere between GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, other Gulf rivals of Turkey. And you started to see the EMGF and the GCC lines converge and become a bit more blurred. And I think that certainly caused concern in Ankara, because while they were competing in the Eastern Mediterranean with indigenous and neighbors there, they had the Gulf over here. But when the lines became blurred, I think that caused them to really change tack. And as I mentioned before, I think the US withdrawal certainly is raising fears about Iranian activity, the proxy networks that it sponsors in the region. Certainly Turkey, while sometimes it can have somewhat of a collaborative relationship, it's not a productive relationship at all. And it recognized that there are a lot of limits to this. And certainly Gulf countries, their line has been very clear on how they perceive and how they interact with Iran. So they recognize that they're going to need Turkey, at least in a limited capacity, to counter Iranian aggression, to counter Iranian efforts. And I think that this also explains, and we're not talking about this today, but this also explains to an extent the Abraham Accords as well, trying to, of course, see what spaces are possible to cooperate with Israel on. And so, this certainly, we're starting to see the sand shift a bit more in the region in terms of alliance systems.
That what we're seeing between Turkey and the United Arab Emirates is the establishment of guardrails, so to speak, to prevent this relationship from really spiraling further. Because in terms of their foreign policy outlooks, from what I can tell, President Erdogan has not abandoned his support for political Islamism or Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups in the region, and the United Arab Emirates has not dropped its opposition to these groups either. What do you think?
I think that's a great question. I think that, again, I think Turkey recognized that its strategy wasn't working. Its economy, had a lot of constraints to the strategy that it was trying to pursue. Even imposing itself as a leader of the Sunni community and the Islamist community in the Middle East, trying to pose itself as kind of like the leader of the Ummah. And it was working to an extent, but not really. And I think that you're right, like Erdogan has now moderated a lot of his behavior. It is kind of toned down on the messaging component that it had to a lot of these, factions in Palestine, in Egypt, in Libya to an extent. And I think that we're seeing, certainly a shifted behavior there. That being said, I do think that there are constraints to this emerging UAE and Turkish relationship. One of the reasons why this was costly in the first place was because the UAE was such a lucrative destination for foreign direct investment, for trade. They had a very flourishing commercial partnership before ties really started to deteriorate. And so I think for Turkey and both the UAE as well, they're trying to stand up guardrails around a flourishing economic relationship first, then move on to the political and security elements. You're seeing the same thing happen, of course, with the Abraham Accords. With the Abraham Accords, it was all about banks, interaction between financial sectors, investment, infrastructural investment, commerce, things like that. And I think that you're going to see the same thing with Turkey, because that's where Turkey is the most interested in opening its doors. Turkey certainly needs it right now with the economy the way it is. And on top of that, too, they understand that is, the door or the window where they can then try and set an understanding for what political and security cooperation would look like. The problem, of course, is that while the tone and the behavior has somewhat changed, there's still very divergent ideological interests in play. And I'm not necessarily sure if both states are going to be able to reconcile this. But especially as the security situation in the landscape in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, as it grows a bit more hostile and the threat posed by Iranian-backed groups and aligned groups there, as that threat becomes more amplified, I think that Turkey and the UAE are going to be able to turn that page and put some of the ideological rivalry behind them to counter this threat. So, in many cases that might trump, some of these concerns. But in the interim, when, a lot of these ideologies are still very much embedded into their style of rule, their national interests, I'm not necessarily seeing, this race to political and defense cooperation. I don't think we're going to be seeing any joint exercises anytime soon. It's also important to remember that Greece, while certainly, Greece is not going to be able to really stop this partnership from taking place, it is now going to feel a bit more isolated. The economic and military overtures that the GCC has offered Greece, it might try and use that as leverage to put constraints around Emirati and Turkish partnership.
Speaking of constraints, my last question actually ends up tying the three countries we talked about today together: Qatar, Turkey and the UAE. And I'm wondering, because the sort of almost glacial pace that we saw Turkey and the Emirates move to reach this point compared to Turkey's other reconciliation efforts, whether it was in the past with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, or Israel before those collapsed sometime around May when the conflict in Gaza renewed. It's been the same case between the UAE and Qatar, where they took a very long time to really begin speaking to each other or even meeting in the same room after the boycott came to an end. And
Right.
I imagine that there might be some questions, of course, on all sides, and like how this might influence the dynamics going on here. One of the ones that you mentioned I thought was really important to bring up again is the commercial element, because as far to my knowledge, the UAE was actually a far bigger commercial and economic partner to Turkey than Qatar has ever been able to match since. And right now, with the Turkish economy struggling so heavily with, as you mentioned, also inflation, unemployment, COVID-19, the Emirates has a lot that they can possibly offer Turkey and get concessions on. So what I want to ask you is, do you foresee any problems that could arise between that rapprochement between Turkey and Emirates for Turkey's relationship with Qatar, or do you think it might be something that we should just wait and watch?
I think that yes, there definitely could be wrenches thrown into these emerging ties, and I don't necessarily want to put this on the same plane as the Abraham Accords, because they're very, very different. But at the same time, I think it's a useful example of, look at rapprochement between Gulf states and Israel, and then all of a sudden the clashes in Gaza happened, and then that really froze progress that was made with the Abraham Accords. And according to national interest, that was rightful, just because two very ideological interests were being put in play, and they then saw the constraints of that partnership, and the timing of that also very much mattered. And so that's why you saw a very significant pause in those ties. And I think that for Turkey and the UAE, I don't think they'll ever have a Gaza moment, so to speak, but I certainly do see something. For example, if something were to happen in the Eastern Mediterranean, if hostilities between Greece and Turkey started, if they resumed, or if there was something that pit these two very core ideological differences and national interests against each other, then we would start to see the pause in economic ties, and these two countries would not proceed to that next level of political and then security cooperation. I certainly see the Eastern Mediterranean being a potential flashpoint, but at the same time, I also see that if this relationship goes well, and if there is a degree of productivity and progress made, not only with the UAE, but with other GCC countries. For example, if Saudi Arabia is able to lift the boycott, or if they're able to open up ties. I think that Saudi Arabia is a bit more tough than the UAE at this point. But if they're able to unlock cooperation in the GCC, it's also very possible that this could then seep into the Eastern Mediterranean and have a positive effect on Turkey and the very contentious Turkish and Greek relationship. Potentially, it could trickle into a political settlement over Cyprus or dialogue over Cyprus. This certainly has many different directions it can go to, but at the same time, one can still affect the other in a negative capacity as well.
And I would just want to ask one last thing that came to my mind also. It's that any any continued stability between Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, sorry about that, would be contingent on relations probably between the UAE or the GCC more broadly and Qatar, I imagine.
That as well. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that's also another kind of extra. I don't want to necessarily say extra regional, but another component of this relationship that has the ability to either enhance or disrupt UAE Turkish ties. And I think that certainly if progress was stalled in the GCC rapprochement with Qatar, I think that also certainly could affect Turkey, because at the end of the day, the relationship, the thriving relationship between Qatar and Turkey. Turkey understands where its bread has been buttered, so to speak, over the past few years, while it was regionally isolated, while it was undergoing such economic strain, and while it was also taking a lot of risks in the region. And Qatar was its main partner in all of this. So, I think that certainly would, realign Turkish interests almost immediately if it ever came down to that. But I think because of that, the UAE and its partners, it's going to be a bit careful. Same goes with Egypt as well. I think they're going to be careful in approaching this to ensure that everything goes smoothly, because you have the case of Gaza as a perfect example of how quickly political tensions and hostility can disrupt economic cooperation.
Caroline, it's always a pleasure to really have you back here on Turkey Abroad. So I'll take now to extend a future invitation to you next time any of these topics come up again. It would be my pleasure to have you back and get your thoughts.
Absolutely. I'm happy to come on anytime. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, pleasure's all mine in any case, but we've reached the end of the program, and my name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.